Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. How's it going, Joe?
Doing good. Doing good. Just went to the climbing gym this morning and went on a quick run to Costco before the Thanksgiving madness starts this week. So
I think it started last week from what I saw, so I'm
mm,
just hunkering down for the moment.
it's probably wise. Yeah.
Multiple types of madness at once. So yeah,
Well, the Costco by your place is the world's largest Costco.
yeah, yeah. That place
So
is
it's a
great.
big store. So I guess it's nice in a way though, because the parking lot can be packed, but the store is so big that people are pretty distributed out. So,
That's
but
a good point. You just have to watch like the toilet paper aisle. It's a little bit dangerous.
that's a good point. But cool. Yeah. So this week we wanted to talk about a topic that we hear a lot from our clients. They have questions on um, how should we think about real time versus batch, right? So this comes up all the time. I guess streaming is another word for what we'll call real time. But at the end of the day, we're talking about fast moving data versus batch data. So
Yeah, and I think what we find is that most of our clients probably have some use case where real time becomes really interesting, where it would help their business somehow.
mhm.
Part of the reason we wanted to do this was to talk about the business case, and part of it was to discuss the technology a bit, because I think real time and different real time architectures have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. And in particular, it's much easier to stand up than it used to be. It used to be a really daunting challenge where you had to get your own open source software and install it on servers, manage those servers, have SREs 24 hours a day managing systems. And I don't think that's really the case anymore. So we'll get into that a bit later.
Right. So I guess it sort of begs the question: what do we mean by real time?
Yeah, and I think as we were discussing a little earlier, real time, or maybe the preferred term is near real time, just means whatever rate you need that's faster than what you used to have. It's very vague, but like you brought up the example of high speed trading.
Yeah, I mean, in high-speed trading, in that case, you need data that's, in some cases, processed in nanoseconds and, making trades and all that sort of thing. I mean, it's an interesting one. Like, real time means different things to different people, I think. If you're a
Absolutely.
high-frequency trading firm, I mean, there's a reason that geography is incredibly important for these trading firms. They need to be close to the exchanges. They need to be, have high speed connectivity um, because it's absolutely necessary, right? So, whereas if you are a retailer, maybe you don't need that level of nanosecond precision,
Mhm.
right? So, I think that what our qualifying criteria is, you're ingesting data and responding with actions as quickly as possible that make sense for your use case and for your business. I think that's probably what we settled on as our rubric or definition for real time or near real time.
Right. And it's like any area of technology, right? There's a lot of diminishing returns. And so for most retailers to get down to, thinking about milliseconds even would be astoundingly expensive with very little return. On the other hand, getting down to like 30 seconds or a minute might make a big difference in their businesses in various ways. And so it might be worth the spending to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Right. It always comes back to, I think, the question we have for people when they discuss uh, basically anything data related, right? It's like, what action are you going to take?
Yeah.
So if this
Yeah.
action is important and time sensitive, definitely consider real time. And if it's not, then consider batch. It's perfectly okay, right? There's not a right or wrong answer. I think it's just it really depends on the context and again, what action are you trying to do? So.
Yeah. Yeah. Fundamentally, I mean, batch has some performance and efficiency advantages, and we'll get back into that a little later when we talk about these various hybrid architectures that have popped up to address this problem. Typically, the streams themselves, they're expensive to process, and so you want to kind of keep them. We'll get into more of those architectures later, but typically, if you want to process a huge amount of data at once, then there's going to be an advantage to using batch versus stream. On the other hand, you want to hybridize that with something that can respond very quickly to events, depending on the time scale of your business.
Mhm. Yeah. So what are some example use cases of maybe a real-time system?
So we already brought up the high-speed trading example. In the retail space, Black Friday is a great example of a time when you might want more real-time responses. And so online retailers typically now are constantly advertising through various channels, and they may want to tweak that advertising in response to what's going on their site. So for example, if I have a doorbuster deal that I post and I advertise that through Google ads or Facebook ads, I might find that certain doorbuster deals are extremely popular and sell out almost immediately. And so if that happens, I probably don't want to keep advertising those deals because I'm going to antagonize my customers and just burn extra money. So they're going to come into my site and realize that the 50-inch Samsung TV that I was advertising is all gone out of stock and they can't order it. And then they'll probably just go somewhere else. So instead, I should be advertising the 60-inch Sony TV, say that's still in stock, and try to get them to look at that deal. And ideally, I can respond to those trends within minutes or maybe even tens of seconds.
Hmm. Yeah, we saw this play out in COVID times. I think when the pandemic started, the companies that had very robust you know real-time systems, I think were able to respond with their supply chain a lot quicker than um, you know retailers that were antiquated, right? So just because everything had changed so quick that you need those signals very quickly to reallocate inventory, show deals to people and so forth. Another good example of a use case is for gaming, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
I mean, that is a data intensive uh, application for sure, and definitely a great use case, especially online gaming right now. Real time's incredibly important, and I think another use case would be another area would be IoT, Internet of Things.
Yeah.
Something that's generating just a lot of events. Whether it's like motion detection, video, anything that sensor's capturing, basically, all that needs to get fed somewhere and ideally responded to. But again, I think it also comes back to like, what action are you trying to take?
Exactly.
This is
Yeah.
important. So, because what we see is there's this, I think, a push for everything needs to be real time. But then when you ask people, okay, so what actions is that? What are you going to do with that data, right? If everything's real time, and what actions are you going to take that's markedly going to have an impact on your business or your workflow? And sometimes people can answer that, and sometimes not.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And so I think when you start addressing real time, it's an opportunity to address your business culture as well, to see where you could actually make changes. Because often what happens is you build these expensive real time systems and then they end up generating reports that sit on someone's desk. And it's like, well,
yeah,
traditional data warehousing is fine. Or in some cases, they're generating real time dashboards and people like stare at those dashboards like they're staring into the sun, but they don't do anything. It's like, well, if you're not doing anything, then you've probably spent a lot of money just to stare into the sun. Like you need to have a way to actually do something with that data for it to be valuable.
right. Yeah, I think we're of the strong opinion that anything that you do needs to have an action associated with it. Whether the action is somebody reading a report and taking an action on it,
Right.
or whether that action is an automation that's driven by a data stream. Um, but to mindlessly stare at a report that's updating in real time, I think that's a total waste of time. And I don't know what action you're going to really derive from that. So I mean, there was a billboard actually from a local company here that said, binge watch your business. And I think it had this executive on their iPhone just like staring at, whatever report. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say, if you have to binge watch your business might kind of suck actually. Because if you're having to binge watch um, a graph, that I think is symptomatic of a lot of issues more than anything. I'm of the opinion that anything that requires you to spend time looking at a real-time report might be better off being an automated action and not
Exactly.
just an update to a graph. I mean, what literally, like, what are you going to do with like new information that comes, that's like updated 5 milliseconds ago or something, right? And and then the data arrives in that interval. Like, what action can conceivably take? I think at that point you should definitely consider um, automating that.
Right. Because as a human, if you're spending too much time on the real time aspect personally, you yourself are staring at those graphs, then you're probably not doing a lot of strategic thinking. So really what
Hmm.
executives should be doing is making decisions about how their systems will respond to those events. Like, well, what
Yeah.
should we do when a product sales out? What's our strategy? And then implement that so it just happens automatically, and then monitor the response and say, okay, how do we do with this particular response that we put in place?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's a tactical use of data, right?
Yeah.
And then there's strategic use of data. I think we're firmly in the camp that um, as much as possible, you know, don't binge watch your business. Like binge automate your business, and outsource all those tactical needs um, to code, and let your executives focus on the strategic stuff. What's going to drive the company, right? So, that's where human insight comes in. But yeah, so I think it's one of those things where we get asked, okay, so can we make real time reports, right? It's like, again, you get to reiterate the question, like, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And until you've decided, you may actually just end up sinking a bunch of money into a project that's going to actually cost you time and just be a distraction. So if
Hugely,
you
yeah.
come up with some good tactics that you'll use in response to events, then that's good strategy. Like, and then
Hmm.
monitor tactics, make sure they're working appropriately. That's good strategy.
Right. I think it sort of comes back to as well, like, the criteria that we would suggest evaluating your real-time use case. So there's a couple of things, like events are happening too quickly for humans to handle, right? So that should be automated. So if you have high volume, um, and you need high volumes of data, and you need to take quick actions on those, that should be automated, and that is a perfect real-time use case.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like advertising, right? If you are spending a bunch of money on useless advertising that's just leading people to a dead link on the site or to an item that's sold out, you should respond to that quickly. It's money down the drain.
Hmm.
And alternatively, if you find an item is popular, then maybe you should advertise it more. Maybe it's a big opportunity for you. So,
For sure. And it presents the e-commerce example is a very interesting one, because there's an interesting feedback loop that starts happening amongst e-commerce competitors, right? So say you're scraping another competitor's site for pricing information, and dynamically updating your own. If you're dealing with a competitor that is able to update their pricing faster than yours, that forces you to have to compete at a faster rate as well. So it becomes a sort of red queen effect, where you're just running faster and faster to stay in the same place just to keep up. But that's how the world is now.
yeah.
So.
And I think sometimes retailers get away with this for a while because they operate in a niche, right, where there's not a lot of competition. And so maybe
Mhm.
there's slightly overlapping competition that they see and they start to notice. But at some point, you probably need to change your practices, or because if you're operating in an area with really nice fat margins, then someone else might be attracted to that at some point.
Yeah, it's old Jeff Bezos saying, right? So your margin is my opportunity.
Yeah.
So,
So watch out for
you know,
Amazon, basically.
yeah, yeah, they're really good at what they do. So
Yeah.
bad props to Amazon. So let's talk about some architecture models. For batch and real time.
Yeah, and we could almost talk about a bit of history. I mean, the pure batch model has been around for ages, since the 80s, since the concept. I mean, I think technically, if you read various articles, the concept of data warehousing was maybe even invented in the 70s. And that's batch typically, like gather your data maybe every day and then post process it, get it ready for analytics. Real time, real time has appeared in a lot of different places. It's very important for SREs, right? For site reliability engineers to be able to monitor infrastructure and make decisions about how to respond to that. And that goes back to at least the 90s, fairly early 2000s, but probably even earlier, because people have been monitoring industrial systems and processes since, who knows, for ages, essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for a while. And the batch paradigms, I think, are still in full swing, because they work, right?
And
So.
it's efficient, right? It's efficient to package up data and then process it all at once. That's the idea of a columnar database, for example. Just pack all these data points together into one file in a column, and then you can scan that very quickly.
Mhm. Yeah. And so, I mean, on one end of the spectrum, I mean, there's definitely the pure batch
Yeah.
architectural model, that I think most people are familiar with. Um, you know, you started seeing things like Lambda architectures, I think, pop up in the late 2000s or early 2010s. And that's sort of a hybrid model where you have your batch system, then you also have, your event-driven system sort of running in parallel. And at some point, these systems are reconciled. But it was built around the notion that the world's kind of moving in a direction where you're going to have to handle and analyze some real-time events. So,
Yeah. And
and that
this type of architecture tends to be useful where you want to do like year over year analysis. So if I want to ask, okay, let's look at what's happening in the last 5 minutes, and then let's look at what happened a month ago around the same time or something. And then I
mhm,
can query my batch system, and I can constantly monitor my streaming system to watch the events coming in.
right. Yeah, and then another one sort of came out in the kind of early to mid 2010s of capital architecture. It was
Yeah.
I think Jay Krebs from everyone's Confluent. I mean, I think he came up with the architecture where it was just purely event driven,
Yeah.
and I think that's got its place. And I think proponents of capital architecture will are of the belief that everything should just exist in the event stream. And so you run into this interesting conundrum. I wouldn't say conundrum, but an interesting scenario where your event stream basically becomes your data warehouse as well, or your
Right.
database. There are some schools of thought that think that this is the way to go and might be the way of the future. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. I would just say that it's based upon your context, right? So if that makes sense for you, then go for it. But you need to be careful of evaluating it as well. Because there's a notion of you know uh, hot and warm and cold data, for example, right? And so in some cases maybe it's better to offload some of the data you're not accessing as much, into cold archival storage versus having it always on, in hot data. So
Yeah.
again,
And you can pack the data together so it's more efficiently queried. You take the
mhm,
events, kind of repackage them and compress them and break them out into columns so that various types of queries run extremely fast.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's definitely some use cases for that, I would say, but again, it's not a one size fits all. I mean, I think there's vendors out there that will always lead you to think that everything needs to either be an event or conversely that there's no need for events. I think that argument is becoming less and less um, true. I guess every day, right? So
Yeah.
in our opinion, I don't know. In my perfect world, I think everything would be an event, but it's also the question. Well, if it is, then what are you going to do with it?
Exactly right. Yeah. So identify where your business value is. And if your business value comes from being able to get updates every hour with a 1 hour latency, then maybe you don't need everything to be an event exactly. You need just fairly fast batch systems instead.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
but
think
here,
go ahead.
what's that?
Oh, I was just going to say there are a couple of other recent developments we can talk about, but go
Yeah,
ahead.
let's talk about it. No, go for it.
Yeah, yeah. I think two recent developments that we've seen are the emergence of managed Lambda architectures. And so, usually in the past, when we were talking about a Lambda architecture, it was something you had to build yourself. And having an off-the-shelf product that basically supports this makes a huge difference. And in practice, with these managed Lambda architectures, you can query with SQL, and you really don't see the difference between batch and stream. It's just all taken care of for you behind the scenes. And so, like Imply supports this. BigQuery has an architecture like this. Snowflake, I would call that very close to a Lambda architecture. It's not exactly Lambda, but it gives you a couple of minute latency if you use Snowpipe, and you're basically getting very close to real time data with very little
Mhm.
extra work. And then the other paradigm we've talked about is one that was introduced by Google called the data flow paradigm. And you can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, the data flow is an interesting one. When we read the data flow paper that came out of Google, I think it was what 2015 or something like that. It came out. I think that was when I think my opinions on real time started shifting a bit. My thoughts, I think, because I had this notion of instead of thinking of things as real time and batch, think about time windows, right? So bounded, which would be more batch, and then unbounded, which would be more real time. So, but when you think about your data needs, really, I mean, your time intervals are really they're artificial. I mean, data is always happening, or data is always being generated. Events are always happening, and really, I think if you think of data streams as sort of more of a time boxing endeavor, to me it's a different mental construct. And what the data flow paper had illustrated is that if you start thinking about things in terms of bounded and unbounded, um, it provides maybe a way of reconciling, handling, streams and batch in one system now, right? So that's pretty cool. So, so instead of like writing a code base that independently handles your batch and independently handles your streams,
Exactly.
now it's all one thing. And I think that
Yeah.
was pretty game changing.
Yep.
I hope the Beam project, gets more traction, because I think of all the paradigms I've seen, that may be, from a pipelining perspective, the best one out there right now, in my opinion.
Yeah. Absolutely. Being able to use the same code in both contexts makes a huge difference. And yet behind the scenes, Beam is still kind of optimizing for batch so that you get some of that efficiency, even though you're
Mm-hmm.
using essentially the same code. And I mean, even Spark Streaming does some of this, right? That's another example. Technically, maybe that's a Lambda architecture, but it's a similar idea in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that you can write
It's
the
more
same.
micro batch though, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
I
right.
think that what Beam, the other thing that Beam really, the data flow paradigm really addressed was late arriving data,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that was a big
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
So say an event, is generated but happens to arrive later, it's still bucketed according to what windows you've chosen. So I think that was
Yeah.
a big solve problem
Yep.
there.
I think the problem with late arriving data is that every company that was dealing with real-time problems had to think about this, but they did it in terms of, baling wire and duct tape instead of saying, no, this is not, you're not going to just throw a patch on something or a band-aid to fix this. It's a core part of what you have to do in your system. And so it was built as a
Mm-hmm.
core part of the data flow architecture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a cool one. I think that we're seeing definitely Google promote, um, and I'll be very curious to see where it goes.
Yeah. I
So.
mean, anything that Google does internally becomes extremely influential. You can look
Mhm.
at MapReduce and GFS. These became the basis of Hadoop, of course. And data flow from the get-go is available as part of the Beam project, which Google open sourced also in
Mhm.
2015 when the paper was released. So it'll be interesting to see the growth there versus the improving performance of, hybrid managed Lambda architectures as well. Like Google also supports that with BigQuery, and a number of other vendors do too.
Mhm. And maybe another paradigm that we should quickly touch on is just, everything's an event, and it actually bypasses a database entirely, right? So it just goes to the event stream. I mean, you're starting to see that more and more, and it sort of goes back to Kappa architecture. But I remember some talks that we hosted at the data engineering meetup earlier this year. You know, it was a talk on just event-driven architecture. It was, to me, it was definitely a really good talk, in the respect where it just opened my mind to what could be possible if you just didn't even have a database, and you just had events that went into streams, and you just subscribe to those streams and do stuff with the streams. I think that's an interesting paradigm that
Yeah.
might get more traction, but I would say a lot of businesses right now have, uh, it, it's going to be hard to retrofit a lot of your architectures to be completely event driven.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely true. But it does loop us back to another thing that we talk about once in a while. I mean, we're mostly focused on analytics, but at the same time, we do like to talk about cradle to grave data architecture, and that is when you're designing your application, design with analytics in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're using this, distributed real-time architecture or some other architecture, think from the get-go. Okay, what kinds of data points do I care about, and how is my application going to generate those? And where are they going to flow? What kind of streaming system might they go into, and where are they going to end up, and how will those impact my business? Is that's just a major headache for every DBA, ETL engineer, data scientist, data engineer, is dealing with malformed data, because when someone's designing an application, they weren't thinking about the later consumer of that data. They just put it in some kind of an object that got mapped to a database with no thought whatsoever about where it was going after that.
Mm-hmm. This happens a lot.
All the
So,
time.
yeah, and we get to see this a lot. But yeah, and I think some of these architectures were created before, um, I would say the latest upswell and sort of data science revolution, right? So, um, but that being said, you still see this going on, especially when you have a CRUD app, for example.
Yeah.
Um, it's the data in there mutates a lot, so it's maybe not the best thing for analytics, right? So if you do like your nightly batch export out of the the database you're using for your CRUD app, you're only going to get, it's basically you're just snapshotting because you don't get the version history, right? Unless you're using things like change data capture, for example, or like temporal tables. I think SQL Server has, you can enable temporal tables, so it just keeps a version, which is pretty cool, actually. MariaDB actually also does this. But I think things like that will make your applications, at least your database, a lot more analytics friendly, because the thing you're going to need in your data warehouse, for example, or like slowly changing dimensions, right? So you want to be able to track dimensional changes. What record is now valid? What records did we have in the past? And possibly be able to compare those against the data in your facts. So that's one thing I think you're definitely right on. It's like, infrastructure and dev should definitely be analytics focused from day one.
Absolutely. And it's a hard problem, right? Because the dev needs to think about, okay, I always have to keep the current customer state coherent, right? I need to know what orders they have in queue. I need to know what their address is. I need to know what their phone number is, name, all this basic data that in many cases can change over time. But at the same time, from the analytics perspective, those should also be events, because a change of address can indicate interesting things about what the customer's needs might be in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Point is to think about it, right? Don't just assume, leave it to chance and say, oh, I'm just going to design for current customer state and let someone else worry about the event architecture. It's a bad habit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can't even count how many times, I know I've seen reports change because the data in the underlying database had changed, right? And then people are like, well, why is their customer mix now different? Well, because people had moved and changed addresses, so now their addresses are different, for example. Or if you're making a machine learning model, and you're trying to version the data that you've used, if your underlying database is changing and you're not being able to track the versions of those records, then your model's going to change, and that's kind of how that goes. So,
well, and even really banal problems like this example, we saw an example where there was an invoice generation system and you could pull an old invoice, right? So you could say, pull this invoice from 2005, except that the invoice system pointed to the current version of data. And so it would generate it with the current phone number, current address. And so the invoices were useless if you try to look back in time. And so you need current state, but you also need that history in various ways. And for machine learning, especially, it's really critical.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, the final thing we want to talk about is just, the bottom line is don't make the business wait, right? So with any system, whether it's batch or real time, you need to make sure that you get data to the business as quickly as it's necessary.
And useful.
Right? So to me, it's a cardinal sin. When you have maybe a data warehouse pipeline that takes like 48 hours to run and the business needs data hourly, you need to figure that out. That a 48-hour timeline is not acceptable. That's a cardinal sin. You're not doing the business any favors, but it also comes down to making sure that, again, you have a robust pipeline and storage and processing and everything else in line. If you don't, then don't let the work get out of control, right? So that pipeline that took you an hour to run now takes 48 hours to run, right? That's something you got to stay on top of for sure.
Yeah, and it helps to sit down, from the business culture management perspective, to just sit down and say, okay, our pipeline takes 48 hours to run. Let's see if we can identify some ways in which that's costing us money, because good data architecture costs money, right? There's a tendency to think of IT as a cost sink. And if you can sit down and say, this is costing us this many millions of dollars a year, then people will no longer see you as a cost sink. They'll realize, oh, IT, by building more robust data pipelines, can save us several $1 million a year, or make several $1 million a year in profits.
Well, yeah, especially these days, right? I mean, any company that isn't seeing data as an asset to invest in and to drive their business, I'm very doubtful that those types of businesses are going to be around the next 5 to 10 years. They're going to get killed by the businesses that are data first and making the investments. And like you say, don't see data as a cost center. They see it as a revenue driver because that's exactly what it is if you're using it right. And if you aren't using it right, then you should figure out how to use it right. Because
Yeah.
again, your competitors are going to do that unless you happen to be in some industry where everybody is just stuck in the 1980s, in which case, then you're just going to have somebody coming out from left field and completely destroying all of you.
Yeah.
So don't think of data as a nuisance. Don't think of your infrastructure as um, some crufty thing that you can just sort of take for granted. I mean, if you're running your business correctly in the 2020s, it's all about the data.
Yeah. I mean, going specifically for this example, we'll have an article in the show notes about how Amazon does price changes. It's actually from 2018. So Amazon probably does even more sophisticated stuff now. But in 2018, they were updating prices every 10 minutes. And so if Amazon decides to get in your space, they're going to be updating their prices every 10 minutes to compete with you. And
Yeah, I mean,
that
how many items was it on?
was it 2.5 million
I
they
think
were
that's the
saying in the
number.
article?
Yeah,
It must be a
yeah.
lot more now. Yeah.
I mean, that's yeah. I mean, that's a lot of data to be readjusted like every 10 minutes. And I'm sure maybe they got that cycle down now. That was from 2018, that article. So, and who knows how old that data was in the article. But yeah, point being, Amazon's a behemoth for a reason because they're data driven. Data is central to everything they do, and it's these pipelines that enable it, right? They've invested into the infrastructure that they now sell to you on AWS, but they invented this because they had specific use cases that they needed to attend to, and you can see this represented in the stuff they sell in AWS. I mean, they got some great products, DynamoDB, great database. And
Kinesis for streams,
mhm.
very easy to manage streams in Kinesis, and Kinesis Firehose, you can run queries on top of your streams just without passing into another system even.
Mhm. Yeah. So, it's again, we're not trying to be fear mongers. I think it's a realistic take on, take your data pipeline seriously. And again, like business shouldn't have to wait. They should be able to get the data they need. Because again, if they're not, um, then the business is at a competitive disadvantage against that other competitor that is going to take it seriously and make the investments. So,
Yeah.
and
So
any other thoughts on batch versus real time?
yeah, just start thinking about it now. I don't think either one of us, in most contexts, advocate for trying to turn everything into real time. It gets expensive, but look at your business and see where the use cases are and where you can save money and where you can make more money. That helps
Yeah.
you employ people and contribute to the economy and have a more successful business.
And thankfully too, it's easier than ever to get started. I mean, if you're
Right.
in any of the three clouds, there's great data pipelining tools you can use for streams or batch. There's great storage solutions that accommodate either situation, and really it's be thankful you're living in this period where it's you have a just endless tooling out there, whether it's through the clouds directly or proprietary third party tools. There's an open source projects galore. I mean, everyone's sort of addressing this. So I'd say just take the time. First understand your use case, do your homework on the tools, and then figure out a game plan from there. So
Yeah, it's a great time to geek out, right? Like we look at all these technology changes just in the last couple of years, and it's only going to get better and easier, more powerful solutions, more accessible, more turnkey in the future. But
mhm.
there are already a lot of awesome solutions out there.
Yeah, that's right. But cool. Well, hope you have a good Monday, and we'll see you next week. It's been a fun chat. So,
Sounds good.
all right, take care.